Yep, my mic's on. The reason I'm showing you guys this refueling stuff is because I've flown over a whole bunch of terrain all over the world, and it's going to be pertinent to our topic today because we're going to be talking about the global flood. And I've seen some things, topography-wise, which makes me interested in this topic. So let me find if I can get back to my slide presentation. All right. And I think Why Not God is the series, and the second idea of the title is It Makes Sense. And how I'm approaching this quarter is that I want you to be able to maybe throw a rock or a little pebble in somebody's shoe with one of these topics. And preferably somebody who's not been exposed to Christianity, or maybe thinks that Christianity is nonsensical, or that's for those weirdos who believe in the spaghetti monster in the sky. All those, it's out there. But the young people now are rebelling against the rebellion, so they're coming back to God, which is a good thing. But their parents haven't been religious, and so they haven't been exposed to anything. So you're going to probably have an opportunity with some of these lessons, maybe to drop a pebble in somebody's shoe, so to speak, to get them interested, something that's going to go, well, I never thought about that, or I never thought about this. So today's topic that we're going to be talking about is flood topography. And having been a pilot in my career and flown for like 28 years, I flew all over, all sorts of terrain, lots of neat things, saw lots of neat things. And this lesson, let me go back a second, is again, I'm giving all this credit to somebody else. This is not my work. I'm just simply presenting it to you. So don't think that I'm the expert or that I went and dug. What I did is I used information that's out there and available to you at a moment's notice. You could pick up your phone right now and get all this information on your own in a YouTube video. And it's at this YouTube site called Creation Ministries International. And that's where I borrowed this information. And they also have a website called creation.com. So there's your reference material. So this is all borrowed. Those airplane photos were not borrowed. I actually took those. All right, so why are we talking about this? And I want you to get a perspective on the antiquity of the earth. Today they want you to believe that the earth is 350 million years old or billions of years old. And they want to ascribe everything to all these ages and all these eons and everything, that Father Time can create everything that God could, basically. And what I want to show you is there's lots of evidence, if you're looking for it, that shows that we actually live on a young earth. And I want to show you some evidence today about that. And this is something I want you to find is interesting. The global flood happened in 1656, or 1656 years after Adam's creation. Noah's father, Lamech, was alive when Adam was alive. Okay? Noah's son, who survived the flood, Shem, was alive when Isaac was alive, the father of Israel, the father of a nation. So this entire span of time represents 2,200 years. But Noah, who's right smack dab in the middle of it, between Noah's father, Lamech, Noah himself, and Shem, his son, so 3 generations, for us that would be 60 years, right? These guys had exposure to 2,200 years of information. Have y'all ever heard the term raconteur? A raconteur is not a person who chases raccoons. A raconteur is a storyteller. And it's a storyteller who does it in such an interesting way. Now, can you imagine the 2,200 years of stories that three gentlemen could tell? Imagine sitting around a fireplace. I also would like to say the technology that they had prior to the flood was probably significant. And there is some conspiracy theories out there, or some theories out there, that the pyramids may have been created by that group and survived the flood, and the Egyptians just took credit for it in our eon. So there's some lots of neat, interesting stuff about that, but that's not what my topic's about. But what I want you to think about is this oral tradition of people being able to tell stories and being able to talk to the very people that were alive, I can't imagine that if I was these three people, that Lamech could have talked with Adam. I'm not saying he did. The Bible doesn't say he did talk to him, but he was alive at the same time. And Noah was alive when Adam was alive. And Shem was alive when Isaac was alive after the flood. So here you got the creation, you've got the flood, and you got the father of Israel. Lamech, the granddad, Noah, the dad, and Shem, the son, 2,200 years of shared history. So that gives you an idea of how much consolidated information these men had and that Moses shared with us. So now we talked last week about testimony of witnesses. And Moses confirmed, we have the story of the flood here, and I won't go through it, but basically in Genesis chapter 6 it starts. God sees a man's evil and decides he's going to destroy him, but Noah's found favor in his eyes. And in 100 years, Noah builds him an ark according to specifications, and Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, 8 souls were saved by water. Then you've got Ezra in Chronicles saying that, hey, they kept track of Adam, Sheth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem. So if these stories or these things were just, well, the other thing that's interesting too about the oral history and the history of these men, that 2,200 years where these 3 individuals shared that much time and information that could be shared with them. Every culture out there, from the Native American Indians to the Chinese to the New Zealanders, every indigenous people out there have a flood story, have a flood ark. And it's just what happens, the Bible has the most accurate one. And here it chronicles again Adam all the way to Noah and Shem in 1 Chronicles, written by Ezra, a prophet. Then you got the testimony of David. Now this psalm may not be attributed to David, but he said that thou coverest it with the deep, with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up to the mountains. They go down by the valleys into the place which thou hast founded them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass, that they may not turn again to cover the earth. Then you've got the testimony of Isaiah. Isaiah mentions the flood as well. For this, in verse 9, the waters of Noah unto me, for I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so I have sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. Then you got the testimony of Ezekiel, another prophet, who talks about these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, who were all righteous. Even though they were saved, their people were not. And so that's what Ezekiel's bringing up here. He says, these 3 men they should be delivered, but their own souls by their righteousness, says the Lord God, if I cause noisome beasts to pass through the land, and they spoil it so that it be desolate, that no man may pass through it because of the beasts. Though these 3 men were in it, as I live, says the Lord God, they shall deliver neither sons nor daughters, they only shall be delivered, but the land shall be desolate. So despite the righteousness of these 3 men and their good works, they couldn't save their people. And then Ezekiel says that again about those 3 individuals. And then you got the testimony of Luke, and we looked a lot about Luke last week. And Luke goes back, and guess what? If you notice here, in these verses here in chapter 3, Luke, who we talked about last week, he had the most meticulous of all the 4 Gospels, because he interviewed everybody, because he wasn't an eyewitness himself. He interviewed eyewitnesses. And he talks, and he goes back to the genealogy, and if you notice, he goes with Jacob, which is Isaac, is where we were talking about those 2,200 years, those 3 individuals, Lamech, Noah, and Shem. Shem knew Isaac, and Lamech knew Adam. Here we talk about Jacob, the son, whose son was the son of Isaac. And then if you look at, and then it mentions Lamech, and then it says all the way back. So Luke actually does the lineage all the way back to Adam and the Son of God. So when we attack witnesses, and what we saw last week, we said that if a witness testimony can be considered accurate, and that they were present when it happened, they were accurate, they were verified, they were accurate in what they said, and they didn't have a bias, then you could trust them as a witness. So last week we proved that Luke was living at the time when Christ had been there, that the people he interviewed were living, and that all those things were written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and that they were all near to that time. So we have Luke's example. Then we have, as testimony from Matthew and Luke, quoting Jesus. So Jesus actually said that Noah was a real person and that it happened. And he compares himself, he says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also be the coming of the Son of Man." Luke repeats the same thing. So here we got the testimony of Moses, Ezra, David, Isaiah, Luke, and then Paul, if he's the writer of Hebrews. He says, "By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not yet seen, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith." And then you have the testimony of Peter, which Jesse mentioned in his lesson this morning, which sometimes were disobedient. He said that when once the long-suffering God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein a few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Like figure, even baptism does also now save us, not by the putting off of the filth of the flesh, but an answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus. So you've got Peter, Paul, Jesus, Matthew, Mark, and then this list is not exhaustive, but they show you that there's ample witnesses. We've shown that the witness can be trusted, and this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the topology of the flood and see if there's any current evidence that a global flood happened. And I would say, from my experience, I can say firmly yes from what I've seen, and I'll show you that with some of the pictures I'll be sharing with you. The guy that was interviewed in this YouTube video that I borrowed this from, his name is Ron Neller. Ron has a PhD in fluvial geomorphology, and morphology just means change. It's when something morphs. So it's earth changing. And then he's a writer. He's been studying floods, river flows for 35 years, and he writes for the Christian Ministries, and he also writes professional articles for science journals. So what is geomorphology? It's the studying and explaining of the shape of the Earth's surface. Shapes were all recognized as mountain ranges, plateaus, and plains, small scale features as hills, valleys, slopes, and canyons. Individuals' features are called landforms, and we're going to look at 5 specific landforms today. And what's going to happen is you're going to see that this is going to be a gold mine of evidence for the Genesis flood. The world would want you to believe about uniformitarianism. What that basically means is scientists look at something now and they see how erosion is now and how things develop, and they put a timer on it. And they say, if everything is uniform, it means it's going to always be like that. So they measure everything based on uniformitarianism, which means if they can measure something, and this is how much erosion happens in this time, then it's going to take this many millions of years for this to take place. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to find out that these events that are global are not uniform. They're massive in scale, and they cannot explain through uniformitarianism the global flood or the things that you're going to see here in a moment or two. Now, landforms, some of you may have heard of Lucy, you got some splaining to do. And what you guys know what the Mandela effect is? Have you ever heard that term? The Mandela effect is basically when something happens in history that you think happened in history, but what happened is it's actually didn't happen, but so many people said it happened that it becomes part of the folklore. So what happened is Desi Arnaz never actually said this to Lucy, but he's attributed with it. And what's interesting is about that, what he actually said to Lucy one time in one show was, "Lucy, I need an explanation." So, but he never said it this way, but I thought it was funny that that's how things get created when people say it often enough and repeat it often enough, so you can see why. If you've been taught in school over and over again that the earth is billions of years old and all the rocks are hundreds of millions of years old and this took this long to happen, you're going to end up believing it just because of the repetition of it and the repeating of it so often. But you may have something now, after watching this presentation, a small pebble in your shoe that may want you to look a little bit closer. So these are the types of formations you have, and I can't actually read this from my thing, so I'll have to read it off here. We've got mountains, which are evolutionary I can't even say the word. Geomorphologists can't demonstrate how they were formed. They talk about the planation surfaces, which are flat surfaces, and they're not forming today. And those flat surfaces are basically the flat areas that, like after a mountain, there's a flat area. They can't explain those because they're not being formed anymore. Inselbergs are basically a thing that's left over when there's if you take sand and you put a rock in it and then you wash water over it and the sand disperses, then you see the rock. What an Inselberg basically is a formation that's left over after water damage has happened, and because it was big or hard or strong or resisted erosion, it was left. And we'll see some of those examples in this presentation. The next thing is a pediment, which is just a slightly sloped area or bedrock at below higher mountainsides, and those aren't forming today anymore as well, but they're everywhere up against mountain chains. And then there's hard rounded rocks that have been transported long distances, and these are found on top of mountaintops. They are found on plateaus, and they're also found in deep cracks piled in thousands of meters thick in gorges. And you've seen those rocks, and they call them river rocks. In fact, out in the village, they want you to use river rocks for your decoration because they didn't bother to put sewer systems in out there. They have a road, and then you've got everybody, so everybody not having an ugly ditch in front of the yard, they put rocks out there, decorative rocks. So they have river rocks, which are those ones that are smooth. And so what's happened is they've got these smooth rocks all over the world, on top of mountains, on top of plateaus, and they can only be created by water flow and being tumbled. If you ever, I know as a kid we had these little tumbling machines where you could take little rocks in, you can put them in these little tumbling machines, and after a while it'd smooth them out and make them shiny. I don't know if they still make that toy. They're probably a swallowing hazard now. Everything's protected. So that's what the hard rounded rocks are. And what's interesting is these rocks, they can find out where they're actually originally from and that they've traveled thousands of kilometers. And this guy is from Australia, so they believe in kilometers, so you'll see a lot of kilometer references. If you want a translation into miles or feet, I'll give those for you as we go along. Then you've got gorges and water gaps, and what that basically is a gorge and a water gap is a strange phenomenon, because what you have is water normally flows when you flows to the area of least resistance. So you can follow, so anytime you pour water, gravity's going to affect it, and it's going to flow, and it's going to go around hard objects, and it's going to find wherever the lowest area is. What happens with these gorges are in a plateau, and these rivers that went to that plateau should have gone around it, taking the easiest road, but they've gone through it. So that's why they're called water gaps, and we'll see an explanation of why that happened. But geologists can't explain it. So that's an interesting thing. And then they've got submarine geomorphology, which basically means the entire continental shelf, the continental slope, and the next slide. Okay. All right, what does that look like to you? Right, it looks like a canyon, Grand Canyon. All right, look at this right here. That says Moss Landing, and this is Monterey, and this is green. Monterey, there's Moss Landing. Where was that? That whole canyon system is inside the bay of Northern California near Monterey, where Carmel by the Sea and where Clint Eastwood's from, and there's a wonderful golf course out there for all you guys who like to golf. But look at that topography. How did that happen at the bottom of the ocean floor? That's another canyon and gorge. And what we're going to find out is there's going to be an explanation for that, but that's amazing. Did you know the Marianas Trench is 39,000 feet deep? How did that get formed? It's just sitting there in the ocean. There's no current flow that's causing that. So I thought that was to me, this is probably the most interesting picture of all of them, of all the ones that I have, is because that's in the bay. And there's no way that that bay could create that formation underneath there. That happened while that was dry ground and water was running off. So now we'll talk about the global flood. These are the 5 landmarks that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the Tibetan Plateau. We're going to talk about the Grand Canyon. We'll talk about the Three Sisters, which is in Australia. We'll talk about Ayers Rock, which is in Australia. And we're going to talk about Mount Everest. So those are the 4 pictures which I borrowed from the thing. Now the Tibetan Plateau. Here are the things that are interesting about it. The issues of scale, which we'll see in a moment, which means the only way it could have been the Tibetan Plateau. All plateaus are basically sedimentary areas that are flat, and they are usually after a floodplain, and it's the residue and the sediment that's left over after waters have run, it leaves a flat area. What's interesting about the Tibetan Plateau, though, is it's 2,500 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers. Let me say that again, 2,500 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers, which means the flow rate and the flow volume of the river that deposited that plateau must have been at least 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles wide. Have you ever seen a river 600 miles wide? But that's how this plateau is deposited. What's interesting too is that this plateau of sediment is 5,000 meters deep. 15,000 foot deep, all along that plateau, all sediment, all laid down. Now the next thing, and the other thing that's interesting about this plateau is, there's a fancy word there that says lack of bioturbation. And all that means is, normally when you have a little river and you have a floodplain, what goes out there? A plant grows up, an animal walks across it, a bug gets eaten, a plant gets destroyed, something might die there, and then the next time there's a flood, it covers that up. And so every layer in a floodplain of sediment has bioturbation, or basically insects and small animals dying and decaying and staying there and being part of the record. What's interesting about the Tibetan Plateau, there's 0 bioturbation in that 15,000 feet of sediment, which means it was laid all at once. Now think that a 600-mile wide river that went 2,500, which is about 1,900 miles long, all that was laid. So and the fact that it's flat. When things are flat, what happens when you start running water over it over time? It starts to wash away. You start getting little rivets. You get little rills, and it starts to erode. Just look at your yard after it rains. What happens? If you got a low spot or a bad spot, you start complaining, and part of it cracks off. You got to pat more glass. Then you got to get more of those river rocks, and then you have to get the POA to come out and look at it and approve the POA rocks. You know, they actually told us out there, I don't like HOAs and POAs. They told us that we couldn't use gravel rocks. We had to use river rocks. And I said, well, why are you putting gravel rocks all over the road then? Why, it's just annoying. All right. If you can't tell already. So over millions of years, the landscape would have been basically dissected. So if the Earth was 350 million years old or 1 billion years old, this flat plateau would have disintegrated in that time, but it hasn't. It's still flat. Now, Tibetan Plateau. Look at that. Now, this is going to be interesting. This down here is India. All this down here is India. This, all the way from here, is China wants it all. So this is pretty much all China from here over. This is China here too. This little country right here is Pakistan. And this little white line you see here is Afghanistan. This is Afghanistan right here. When you look at that and you see this is a flat surface, it's 15,000 feet deep of sediment. It was laid down by a river 600 miles wide. And doesn't it look that like what you would see if you poured water somewhere and you just drained off, draining off here, drained off there, and look at it. It's just it's pretty amazing. But look at this next picture. All right, here's Afghanistan, and the reason why Afghanistan was so important to everybody, and why we shouldn't have gotten out of Afghanistan in the sense of leaving our air base for the Chinese to take over. Right here is where that air base is in Afghanistan. I flew probably 14 years of my career over this godforsaken place, but we built an air base which was one of the largest, and the reason why is because this little corridor right here goes right to China. China abuts there, and so we had access from this air base to, if wherever what day wanted to go into China from a forward location, that would have been it. But now the Chinese are probably occupying it. And so I saw all this land. Every time I crossed over here, I could see all this runoff and all this wave formation. And we'll talk about the wave formation in a little bit. Now we'll talk about the Grand Canyon for a moment. The current river that's in it couldn't have carved it, and you'll see that in a moment. The canyon, it's basically a canyon within a canyon cut into a plateau. And then there's the receding flood scenario. Here's the Grand Canyon. Now, what do you notice about it? You notice you got these cliffs here, and there's all this sediment, and all the way around, and then you got a large drop off, and then you got kind of a flat area with willows, and then you got way in the middle this tiny, 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 tiny gorge where the river's at. Here's another picture of it. You can see the plateau is all the way up here, flat, all the way over here flat, and then you've got this little river going through it. And one last picture. And here's another example. Again, I got all this offline, iStock. I should have paid Jose from 1983 for this photo, but I didn't. I think God will take care of it for me. So what we have here is you can see all the sedimentary layers in this plateau, and you've got this river that's this wide down at the bottom. And how did it cut that? Well, what's interesting about the Grand Canyon is it ranges from 20 miles wide to 3,000 feet deep, and it goes all the way from Colorado all the way to Nevada, in the Hoover Dam. And so it was one of the neatest things. But the point is that there's no way that tiny river. So what is the explanation of how did that form? Because water made that happen, but how? And geologists can't explain it, but the geomorphologists can, and it's a global flood. The next thing we're going to look at is the Three Sisters. This is a rock formation that is an Inselberg, and it's left over from a mass flood event, and it was from receding water erosion. And they had evidence here of cross bedding. And what cross bedding is basically is when you go down to the beach and you look at the water in the shallow areas where you can see the bottom, you see little ripples at the bottom, the sand does. What happens is what cross bedding is when there's water flowing based on its volume and its speed, it can lay a mound and then it'll drop off. It'll lay a mound and drop off, and the direction of flow can be seen by if it's that way, if it's waving that way, and then how high they are and how much the change in wavelength or whatever you want to call it between each of those levels, you can see how much force was behind it. So what that basically means is in Australia, which we're going to see a picture of here in a second, is the Sydney, where that beautiful opera house is, that's in a basin. And then about 50, 100 miles to the west is these cliffs that drop off, and there's these three little formations called the Three Sisters looking out over, and it's basically a rock formation. But what they determined by the cross bedding that they see in the land and the deposit in that basin by Sydney is they determined that the wall of water that came down that created that environment, that topography, was 65 feet high and 150 miles wide, which can only, again, I've never seen a river 155 miles wide, and I've never seen one that's 65 feet high, unless it's a catastrophic event that the Bible describes as was global. So it demands a biblical proportion, but secular science won't dare. Modern floods within a catchment, which means in a basin area or within a region, we can see the devastation, but it doesn't change the topography like it does here. And it doesn't distribute the amount of sedimentary deposits that is shown. And then anytime when you see a lot of these formations, and you see all those fingers, I guess I'll see it in the next picture. Here are the three sisters, that's what's left over. And the next slide will show you a little bit better picture. Again, you've got the plateau and the sedimentary rock, and the three sisters I just showed you are off the screen right here. But this is what happened, and all these different little gullies that happened when the water went through, and then after the main course of the water cut the big area, then the remaining water creates their little gullies. But what happens is when two or three of these gullies come together, they end up causing a lot of kind of a violent situation. When the two of them come together, that's when these landmarks are formed. And anytime you go out into the painted desert or whatever, and you see like the arch, or you see, that's what these things are. They're leftover rock that survived that violence and didn't get destroyed because they were harder or stronger, or they were made of a different material than the sedimentary stuff. Now, what's also interesting too is this guy, whenever these geologists go somewhere and try to explain why something happened somewhere, they look at it and say they isolate it to that location under those circumstances and don't look at it from the big picture. They don't take it. They take it from an isolated event right there, what could have happened, and they want to explain away God. And so, when you look at this from a global standpoint, if you notice, all these pictures look the same. The Grand Canyon looked like that. These runoffs look the same. And Ayers Rock is called just the tip of the iceberg, and I'll explain why. It's also an Inselberg. It's a rock formation. When you go down under, people it's that big red rock. And I'll show you a picture in a moment. But an Inselberg is basically a rock formation that is left after the sediment has been washed away. And also it's sedimentary, which means it's layered. And it's a type of stone that's vulnerable to weathering, which means it ends up being a young earth. And the reason why is because what's in this Ayers rock is this stuff called feldspar. And when this stuff breaks down, it turns into clay when it's exposed to sun, heat, water, and air. And according to secular geologists, if the Earth was 350 million years old, this rock would have been gone in 10 million years, even under current measurements of how erosion works. So this rock wouldn't exist using their own numbers. And so that shows you they can't explain these things, but they will tell our children that everything's old, 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 old. And the other thing is interesting too is about the position of this rock. This rock is a flat rock with sediments, and it's hard, but instead of being horizontal, it's vertical. And I'll show you that here in a minute. So what you're looking at there, you think the rock is horizontal. The truth is, this 350 meters from here to here, on the height of this rock that's out in the middle of nowhere in inland Australia, there's 6 kilometers worth of rock underneath the ground below it. And it's standing up at an angle. And what else do you notice about this rock? This rock, the sediment should be going this way, the cuts. But guess what? It's not. See how the cuts are? They're vertical. It's standing on its side. How did that happen? How did a bedrock of something that's 6 kilometers long, which is about 4 miles, something that's 4 miles long, a rock this huge that survived this, got turned and put up on its end? Just amazing. And again, geologists can't explain this, but geomorphologists can, and who believe in a global flood. And so this shows you that, this is trying to show you that the bedding is this way, and it should be that way, but it's turned. And so that's Uluru is the name that the Aborigines gave this rock, and so they renamed it. Just like we renamed Mount McKinley Denali, now it's Mount McKinley again, and how the Gulf of Mexico is now Gulf of America. So all those kind of things. All right, anybody recognize that one? Has anybody been there? That's the same thing. That's the same kind of rock that formation, that Uluru is just a little bit smaller. But again, look at the striations. That should be that way if it's sediment. But this rock is a lot harder. Somehow, whatever turbulence had happened when this was laid down, that was turned on its side and kept there. Very interesting. They've been trying to explain that one away for a long time. They've been trying to say it was a volcano before, and it was the plug in the volcano, and so it's a lot of interesting stuff. But if you take a God's eye view at things, all this stuff makes a lot of sense once you take a big picture. And the last monument we're going to look at is Mount Everest, the last landmark. Not as tall as one would think. It's flood-formed sediment. I guess that's the first one. And this is filled with marine fossils. The erosion rates are too high for old Earth, which means young Earth. At the current rate, it would take 10 million years for the continents to be gone at the current rate of erosion. And they say the Earth is at least 350 million years old, if not billions of years old. So all these mountain ranges would be have eroded according to their own calculations. So the secular geologists can't really get over the math problem with this, but it's okay. Hopefully we'll get God on their side. And then if you totally level the entire Earth and you cover it with the water that we have right now, everything would be underwater by 9,000 feet or 3,000 meters. But mountains today are higher than 9,000 feet. So how do we explain this? Here's Mount Everest. These are the fossils that are in Mount Everest. Very interesting. And the other thing is interesting about these fossils aren't just on top. They're all the way through the mountain. And there's another example, but I'm going to see if this works. Here's a 1-second explanation of how this works. Oh, I have it on mute. I did that because it was loud. Let me go back one. Is it off mute now? There we go. Oh.
What do marine fossils on the top of Mount Everest tell us about the biblical flood? Well, we find fossils of marine creatures in limestone near the summit, which means that this area must have been under the sea in the past. Everyone agrees that the top of Everest was once under the sea. However, many people do not associate these rocks and fossils with Noah's flood because they think there is not enough water to cover the highest mountains. However, they are not considering how the flood changed the Earth's topography. The mountain ranges formed at the end of the flood. With vertical earth movements towards the end of the flood, the mountains rose and the water flowed off the continents into the newly formed ocean basins. Indeed, such mountains must have formed quickly and recently, otherwise they would have eroded as quickly as they formed. That's why we have marine fossils at the top of high mountains.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Hey, it worked. Yay. All right, so the big picture. We had a global flood, and by the way, the Bible's always right. We had a global flood which breaks apart the whole world and covers it with 3 kilometers of water, which is about 1.8 miles. The land is then lifted up after about a year, give or take some. You have to go back in Genesis and look at the time frame. But after a period of time, then God rose the land up. The water that was there washed off and created all those nice formations you saw. Created the plateaus, created the ranges, created the mountains and the gorges. And then that water runoff went into, and they lowered the Earth's basin. So like I was saying earlier, is chances are that the Marianas Trench that was formed, it was probably up a lot higher when it created that trench. And just like when we saw that trench earlier, let's go back. It's a lot of work, isn't it, huh? Here's my, right there. That explains how that can be underwater at the sea floor, is that it was all level, and when God raised it up, and then created the mountain ranges and made the ocean floor deeper. That's why there can never be a flood again of this grand scale, because there's not enough water to do it. It's because Mount Everest is now 29,000 feet, and the Marianas Trench is 36,000 feet underwater. So there's about a 60,000 foot span difference. So anyway, the Bible's right, global flood happened. Thanks.